Right, so I'm just pressing. Okay, so press record. So we are now live and recording. Okay, so welcome everyone to this, the first webinar for the module CPD2 on intentional social and technological disasters. As I said, today I'm going to be looking at a particular case study related to the subject matter, and using that case study, which is on an issue, it's on a research area that's related very closely to my own research. I'm going to be using that as a case study to sort of maybe provide you with the basis or a framework to inspire you to go in and look at a particular case study that interests you, and use that as the basis for your essay for this unit. Okay, so let's start then with intentional disasters. So I think we can start by saying very simply that there are two types of man-made disaster: unintentional and intentional. To give you a definition, we can talk about intentional disasters as a disastrous event caused directly and principally by one or more identifiable deliberate or negligent human actions. So we have that as a sort of overarching definition of both intentional and unintentional disasters. Just to give you a sort of an example of an unintentional disaster, right? So these are usually directed against or towards accidental incidents such as a chemical or an oil spill. So a particular example of this might be in Bhopal in India in 1984, which is still regarded as one of the worst industrial accidents in human history. It was a gas leak incident in India, which is still considered to be the world's worst industrial disaster. Between the 2nd and 3rd of December 1984, at a plant run by Union Carbide India Limited, an American company, a pesticide plant in Bhopal in Madhya Pradesh in India, a gas cloud was released from the plant due to the company, ignoring safety concerns and not going about their responsibilities at the plant properly. The gas cloud expelled from the plant spread across Madhya Pradesh, and there were a total of 3,787 deaths within the first week related to the gas release. 8,000 people died within 2 weeks, and another 8,000, or maybe many, many more since then, have died from gas-related diseases. And of course, the reason for this was that a private company had engaged in cost-cutting exercise and safety regulations weren't followed. So whilst it may not have been intentional, it very much was, and it was accidental and unintentional. It's still, a social, technological, or an intentional disaster that we can go away and look at as a particular case study for this kind of for this unit. To give you some other examples of intentional disasters, of course, September 11th, 2001, an act of terrorism against the United States of America. But also in the United Kingdom in 2011, there was something called the London riots. This was caused by the death of a young man in police custody, a man by the name of Mark Duggan, and it was followed by peaceful protests that later turned violent. The 2011 riots in England, they're more widely known as the London riots. Thousands of people rioted in cities and towns across England. There was looting, arson, and it resulted in the mass deployment of the police and even the deaths of 5 people. And again, the types of responses needed to prepare for unintentional disasters like accidents and intentional disasters like civil unrest, in many ways, they're different from an intentional disaster like terrorism. And I'm going to sort of, in this webinar, I'm going to sort of talk about how the United Kingdom in particular has gone about responding to the threat from terrorism as a form of intentional disaster. But the reason why I just sort of brought these examples up for you is just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that you could potentially go away and look at. And there are so many different disasters, crisis events that occur in different countries and regions all around the world that would provide the basis for a case study analysis for you guys when you're writing your essay for this unit. So my suggestion to all of you would be to pick something that you find of real interest in terms of the disaster management, or sorry, in terms of the crisis disaster management literature, and also in terms of a particular topic that really feeds into this sort of intentional, unintentional disaster type of event. Okay, so let's look at terrorism then as a form of intentional disaster and develop an understanding of how we might go about using this as a particular case study for answering the essay question. So, with all essays, I think it's really important to define the key concepts at the very, very start. And of course, if we're going to be thinking about an intentional disaster essay on a terrorist event, one of the first things you might want to do is start by defining the key concepts. And the key concept in this instance would be terrorism. What do we mean by terrorism? There's 7 key characteristics to terrorism, according to the terrorism scholar Louise Richardson, Professor Louise Richardson, who wrote on terrorism in Northern Ireland. I will just quickly ask all of you, someone please feel free to jump in. She says there's 7 key characteristics of terrorism. What do you think is the main characteristic of terrorism as a form of violence that makes it terrorism, that distinguishes it from other types of violence?
Maybe the purpose of the attack is going to be because of just killing as much of people as possible.
Okay, so Salim says that one of the reasons for the attack might be to go about trying to kill as many people as possible. That's very much relates to some ideas and some theories around terrorism in the 21st century. Maybe the killing of innocent civilians is a key characteristic, so I'd agree with that, Salim. But it's not the main characteristic. What is it that about terrorism that differentiates it from all other forms of violence? How does it differentiate from, say, regular crime?
Terrorist setting out to, sorry, Dave. Terrorist is setting out to make a point and to cause maximum shock effect. Okay,
so they're trying to communicate a message. Yeah, absolutely. That's on my list. But there's a reason for them trying to communicate that message. What's their aim?
To bring to attention their cause.
Oh, sorry, there were 2 of you at once there. Sorry, say that again, David, and then Maisa.
Yeah, to bring to wider public attention their cause. Perhaps they're not getting, feel they're not getting a fair hearing.
Okay, absolutely. And then Maisa, what were you going to say?
Maybe attacking that country resources.
Okay, yeah, all of these are key characteristics of how we go about defining terrorism. But for me, right, the key, and I apologise if anyone said this, the line's a little bit breaking up at times. For me, what differentiates terrorism from all other forms of violence is that it is absolutely politically inspired, right? We talk about it as a form of political violence, right? For terrorism to be terrorism, it has to have some kind of political motivation. If not, then it's simply crime. Other key points that you've all identified in terms of how we might go about defining terrorism. Of course, Richardson argues that if the act does not involve violence or the threat of violence, it isn't terrorism. The points that Salim made, and I think David as well was suggesting this, the idea of the purpose of terrorism being to communicate a message, right? The act of terrorism and the victim, they usually have some kind of symbolic significance. You're trying to get a message out that goes beyond maybe your own specific community and draws attention to a particular political cause. Then we get into some of the more controversial elements of her characteristics, of her definition of terrorism. Richardson argues that terrorism is the act of sub-state groups, not states. Now, I say this is controversial because there's a real debate within the terrorism literature as to whether state actors can be considered terrorists or not. Richardson says that only non-state terrorist groups can be considered terrorist actors. States can't be considered terrorist in her eyes. Now, that's very controversial. There are many academics that have argued against that position, but it's just something to be aware of, that there's this debate in the terrorism studies literature as to whether state actors should be considered terrorist or not. As well as this, she argues that the victim of violence and the audience that the terrorists are trying to reach through the targeting of that victim aren't always the same, right? This point around the deliberate targeting of innocent civilians. So those are her 7 key characteristics in terms of this is what makes, this is how we go about defining whether a particular event, a particular act of violence is terrorism or not. Now, there's also a debate about how we go about thinking about terrorism in the literature. Is it a strategy or tactic? And I think that this is a very good way of thinking about terrorism, to think of it more as a strategy or a tactic, right? It's a form of violence that's used by actors to try and achieve a particular political objective. And if we start to think about terrorism in that way, then this idea that terrorism is extremely irrational, sort of loses weight. It doesn't make as much sense, right? For me, most terrorists are committing these acts of violence for a reason. So it's normally that, strategic or tactical, why terrorist events occur. The other thing to think about is terrorism versus counterterrorism. Does anyone know what the difference between the two is?
Counterterrorism is the use of institutional organisations to combat terror organisations.
Excellent. All right. So David's definition or description there is perfect, right? I think it's really important if you were to write an essay about crisis management responses to terrorism to distinguish between the two, right? Terrorism is the thing that we're trying to stop. It's the act itself. Counterterrorism is, as David said, it's the government response to that threat, right? It's about how governments develop policies and practices, techniques to reduce the threat of terrorism and to effectively prevent it from occurring again in the future. So it's worth noting that in terms of the sort of literature in this area, sometimes you will see the phrase counterterrorism used. At other times, you will see the phrase anti-terrorism used. Now, counterterrorism, it's normally linked to offensive or active, what we call coercive measures to fight terrorism. So here we're thinking about, whether it's a police raid, for example, might be a coercive measure. Indefinite detention of terrorist suspects without trial might be a coercive measure. Something called extraordinary rendition, where the United States of America used to take individuals from one country and move them to another place outside of, the realms of international law. Guantanamo Bay being an example, right? These are what we call coercive state-based measures of counterterrorism. On the flip side of that, you have also anti-terrorism, right? Anti-terrorism tends to refer to more defensive or passive, what we call preventative strategies only. And I think when we talk about crisis and disaster management and the threat from terrorism, we're thinking more about anti-terrorism rather than counter-terrorism. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on today. Now, one of the first things that we have to do when we're thinking about terrorism is not just to define the concept, but also to provide context to the issue at hand, right? So here I'm thinking about terrorism in the 21st century. What is it that states all around the world today, in terms of the terrorist threat, what is it that they're facing? And the first thing I'd say is that the study of terrorism is not new. Okay, the study of terrorism and the acts of terrorism is not new. We can trace the history of terrorism back to hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But it's really since about 1968 that, especially in the West, that there's been a real focus on terrorism as an area of study and the emergence of a discipline called terrorism studies. And I'm going to use some of the ideas from that discipline to inform my analysis today. Right, now, so what I want to do first of all then is to provide some context to the threat of terrorism today. And I think one of the key things that we have to say about terrorism today is that it has to be understood in the context of what was called the War on Terror. So the War on Terror was basically a set of policies and practices implemented by the United States of America, the government of the US, under the president at the time, George W. Bush, after the terrorist attacks in New York on September the 11th, 2001. And what's interesting in terms of Western, and particularly the way in which Britain has viewed the threat from terrorism, and that's the country that I'm going to be focusing on today, is that there's been a transformation in what we call threat perception. Okay, so a transformation in what we call threat perception. Now, that threat perception has changed across three incidents that occurred at the start of the 2000s. So the first was the attack in New York on September the 11th, 2001, followed closely by a terrorist attack in Madrid in March 2004, and then finally a major terrorist attack that struck the United Kingdom, London, in 2005 against the transport system. And what we see in this period is a switch from the conceptualization of the threat from terrorism as something that's external to countries in the West, right? So terrorism was seen as something that happens out there. It originates from other countries, to a growing acceptance, maybe a realization that terrorism can also come from within a society. And we see this changing threat perception across these three incidents. It's also worth remembering, I'm going to develop these points as I go on, that the threat from terrorism has been presented very much at the start of the 21st century as new, different from the old terrorism of the past. And of course, this new terrorism, it's seen as being motivated for very different reasons to the terrorism of the past, right? So the new terrorists are seen as being motivated by religion, right? And this is the reason why they're prepared to kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of people if they could, right? Because they don't have limited political aims. They want to completely change and transform the system, which then feeds into their methods, right? Killing as many people as possible. And there's also an argument around the structure of terrorist groups having changed. But as I said, I'll develop some of these points over the next few minutes as I progress through my presentation. Okay, so the terrorist incident in New York in 2001, September the 11th. Now, I've got a question for all of you. Of course, some images here of the devastating and shocking events of that day. 3,000 people lost their lives in one terrorist attack, by far and away the worst terrorist incident in the history of humanity. 10 times worse than the next major terrorist incident in terms of the loss of life, right? 3,000 people losing their lives is still without doubt the worst terrorist incident in the history, as I said, of mankind. Now, does anyone know where the majority of the terrorist attackers on that day came from? Which country?
I think from inside the United States of America.
They attacked obviously inside the US, definitely, but they weren't from the United States. They weren't American citizens. They were citizens of another country.
Yeah. They are from Saudi Arabia and I think Kuwait.
Yeah, it wasn't Kuwait.
Those countries.
Yeah, very good. Well done. Right. So actually 15 of the 19 attackers were from Saudi Arabia. 15 of 19. 2 were from the United Arab Emirates, 1 was from Egypt, and 1 was from Lebanon. So what this does in the minds of policymakers is it crystallizes this idea that terrorism is something, for Western countries at least, something that comes from outside, externally. Terrorists migrate into Western countries and then they can carry out incidents like this, especially international forms of terrorism. Then we get a slight change as we move through to March the 11th, 2004, and the terrorist attack on the commuter system in Madrid. Again, I'll ask you, does anyone know where the majority of the men that carried out this terrorist attack came from? I'll take silence as people not being too sure on this one. Unless someone wants to say something. No? Okay, so the majority of the terrorists this time came from, particularly from immigrant communities within Spain, right? So within the country itself, but these were mainly men from Morocco, Syria, and Algeria, with the support of 2 Spanish citizens. So what we get then is a move, right? A transformation in the understanding of the threat from terrorism, a sort of a change where Western countries in particular start to see terrorism as something that that can potentially originate from within the country itself. And then finally, the last major incident that completes this transformation in threat perception to the kind of understanding of terrorism that we have, particularly in Western countries today. The attack in London, July 7th, 2005, 68 people losing their lives as a result of this attack. Does anyone know where the terrorists came from in this incident? Or want to have a guess? If we're moving from an external threat to an argument that it's more internal. Sorry, say that again, Dave.
UK.
I think, sorry, it was breaking up a little bit. I think I heard you say from inside the United Kingdom, which is absolutely right. Okay, so the attacks were carried out by 4 men in the United Kingdom. All four of them from the UK. 3 were from a northern town in the United Kingdom called Leeds, and another was from a town just outside of London, Aylesbury, in a county called Buckinghamshire. So what we get is a transformation, right? That terrorism isn't just something that comes from outside, but it's also something that can emerge from within a state itself. And this has really important implications for how we understand responding to terrorism, right? We have to know who the terrorists are, what they want if we're going to develop effective countermeasures to prevent terrorist incidents from occurring, and to make sure that the policies we put in place are effective and reduce, loss of life and all of those kinds of things. So it's really important. And again, if you're writing an essay on this particular topic, that you talk about what we mean by terrorism, and then you can go in and focus more in threat perception and how we understand the particular threat, before then moving on to consider some of the sort of crisis disaster management responses that we might go about developing. Again, to think about terrorism in the present context, I think all of these points that I'm about to make are really important in terms of understanding how we go about creating an effective, crisis disaster management response. One of the key things about how terrorism is conceptualized today is that we've seen a sort of a transformation from this idea that there's a terrorism in the past, an old terrorism, to a more new terrorism. And there's a guy here on the right, a famous scholar of terrorism studies called Brian Michael Jenkins, and he's argued that terrorism has changed. It's changed in terms of its aims, its methods, and its structure. So in 1944, Jenkins was saying things like, terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. And the idea behind this is that terrorism is supposed to communicate a message. It's supposed to serve political ends. The idea is that you carry out an act of terrorism for strategic purposes because it's the only way to go about furthering your objectives. It's, in terms of a strategic approach, it provides the terrorists with a way of getting their message out. But if you kill too many people, of course, you can damage your cause. Now, in 2006, Brian Michael Jenkins had argued that actually now what we're facing is something different, a new form of terrorism, where lots of today's terrorists want not just a lot of people watching, but also a lot of people dead. And this focus on new terrorism has led to the emergence of a new concept, something that you might have heard used in relation to, well, basically any terrorist event that occurs, particularly in the West, and particularly when they're talking about so-called Islamist forms of terrorism, this idea of radicalization. How was an individual drawn into? What was the process by which they became a terrorist? Okay, and I'll pick up some points about radicalization in a moment. But just in terms of this idea of new and old terrorism, right? So the argument was, in the past we had these old, more politically oriented groups that were hierarchical in structure, right? They have a support structure. They have a leader at the top. They have operatives just below that. They have then active supporters who play a key role in the organization, and then passive supporters who lend credence, legitimacy, credibility to a particular terrorist group. There's an argument that this structure has changed slightly. Those hierarchical groups have become more networked, and the major terrorist groups of today, they work more not through interaction with one another, but through inspiration. So here we're thinking about Al-Qaeda before before it, and then ISIS since probably about 2011. Groups that inspire the emergence of franchises of particular groups associated with these major terrorist organizations around the world, in different parts of the world. So not directly linked, but networked and inspired by. And again, a change in the types of attacks, right? So the old terrorism being more limited, airline hijackings, attacks on military bases, symbolic targets tended to be the focus of the old terrorists. Today's new terrorists, it's claimed, are much more indiscriminate or mass casualty. One of the big threats that really concerns security professionals is this idea of roaming attacks with guns and knives, right? Or vehicle attacks that we've seen incidents, especially in Europe in the last 2 or 3 years, with these types of incidents. Suicide bombings, which were also the purvey of the old terrorists as well. But again, this claim that terrorists today, if they could, they would use chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons to further their goals. So we've got a transformation here in terms of the types of terrorist attacks that are used. Now, it's worth noting that if you go away and research this area in great detail, that there's some real controversy over this idea of old and new terrorism. Where does the old terrorism end and where does the new terrorism start? Is it really the truth that the terrorism of the past was less deadly than the terrorism of today? If you go away and look at the terrorist incidents that occurred in the past, the bombing of Pan Am flight, I forget which flight number it was, but it was over Scotland in the 1980s. Almost 300 people lost their lives. There were major terrorist incidents throughout the 1970s and 80s where lots and lots of people lost their lives, maybe even more so than today. So there's definitely a controversy over the argument that terrorism today is new and different from the terrorism of the past. But of course, like anything, there are differences. The security response to the threat from terrorism has seen a transformation in the kinds of maybe targets or the way in which terrorists go about conducting their business. Right? You think about how airports today are extremely fortified. It's very difficult to carry out an attack in an airport or against an aeroplane. So that's meant that the terrorists of today have had to diversify their kinds of targets. So there are differences, but the key point here is just to remember that these are contested ideas, and that the notion of a new terrorism is one that is certainly open to debate and contestation. Okay, moving forward. So one of the big issues today is this idea of what's called lone actor terrorism. Lone actor terrorism. So you have a sort of a loosely affiliated network, maybe an autonomous cell that provides ideological inspiration, and then you have terrorist groups. And then outside of that, you have this idea of the lone actor, an individual who may have been inspired by a particular group but doesn't have direct links to them, who then goes away and carries out a terrorist attack. And of course, this is one of the major concerns for governments, right? Because lone actors are very difficult to identify, especially if they aren't directly linked to a particular group. As I said, they're loosely affiliated. They tend more to be inspired by extremism and the messages of terrorist organizations. But what really defines these types of incidents is they are very often low tech. So in Europe, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a real spate of incidents. There was an attack on a Berlin market in Germany in December 2016, where a man used a vehicle to run down pedestrians. You saw something like that in Spain recently as well, in Barcelona. There was the Westminster attack in London in 2017, and there was an attack on London Bridge in June 2017 as well, which is something that I just want to focus in on now, before then going into a discussion of how we respond to a particular terrorist incident such as this in the United Kingdom. So, the London Bridge attack from 2017. On the 3rd of June 2017, there was a terrorist vehicle ramming and stabbing attack that took place in London, England. And what happened was a van was deliberately driven into pedestrians on London Bridge before crashing onto the south bank of the River Thames. Its 3 occupants then ran to the nearby Borough Market area, and it's very shocking what happened. They began stabbing people in and around restaurants and pubs. And the attackers were, it's suggested, all so-called Islamist terrorists who had been inspired by the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. They were shot dead by Metropolitan police officers and were found to be wearing fake explosive vests. So this was one of these sort of random roaming, knife and weapon attacks that really concerns the security services. And on the left of my screen, you can see an image there that shows the timeline of the attack, right? So how at 9:58 the van crossed London Bridge and begun the attack. By 10:07, 9 minutes later, the first emergency call after vans had hit pedestrians on the bridge went through. The three men then abandoned the van and they ran into the Borough Market, which is in London, it's a very, on a Friday, Saturday night, it's a very popular place for civilians, for people going about their normal daily life, for the general public, and they began to attack people in that area. Within, of course, this is a shocking and an awful event, but what's quite, the right word is for it, the response by the authorities was extremely impressive in terms of how they went about dealing with this. Within 8 minutes of the, within 8 minutes of the attack and the first phone call through to the emergency services, the Metropolitan Police had managed to shoot dead all three of the attackers. They were shot dead by armed officers from the City of London and Metropolitan Police Services, as I said, within 8 minutes of the original emergency call. Now, there's a reason why they were able to respond so quickly and save many more lives than many more could have been lost. 8 people were killed in the attack and a further 48 were injured. And if it wasn't for the speedy response of the emergency services, in particular the police, the incident could have been much worse. Does anyone want to have a guess as to why the police were so quick in their response? And it's a very simple answer.
Because they've got units at high readiness that operate in and around areas of interest or vulnerability in the City of London. Excellent.
Yes, very much, David. Right. So one of the key reasons, without a doubt, the resources. In January 2016, before the attack, the United Kingdom government, they'd put 600 more armed officers deployed in London, which had boosted the numbers to around 2,800. And the number of armed police response vehicles was also doubled, right? So we talk a lot, don't we, in crisis and disaster management about preparedness. The City of London and the Metropolitan Police were prepared for this. They were ready and they had practiced it, right? So you think back to our first set of classes in CPD1 where we were talking about the importance of training, right? After a terrorist incident in Mumbai in India in November 2008, which was a roaming weapons attack with guns where terrorists managed to kill a number of Western tourists and also local citizens as well. The emergency services, and particularly the police in the United Kingdom, they had seen this attack and they prepared for it. They were concerned that an incident like this might happen in the United Kingdom, so they'd practice and they'd train. They'd played out their emergency plans for this kind of incident, and they were ready for when it happened. So whilst obviously it was extremely tragic to lose so many lives and so many people's lives were damaged by this event, it could have been so much worse if it wasn't for that quick response, and it's extremely impressive. And so it really does speak to this importance of preparedness in crisis, disaster, or emergency management. Okay, so are you all with me so far? Ahmed's asked me a question about New Zealand recently. Was it a lone actor? I'm just trying to remember what happened there in terms of, it was a lone actor, I believe. It was a young man who, inspired by right-wing propaganda, an Australian, had gone to New Zealand and attacked specifically the Muslim community in in Christchurch, I believe it was, attacked a mosque. And again, I think it was through the easy access of weapons that he was able to kill so many people. I can't remember the exact number of people who lost their lives, but I believe it was over 100. And this feeds into some of the things that I'll just mention briefly in a moment about processes of radicalization, right? The idea of this there being a process by which people come into contact with extreme forms of ideas or religion that then potentially motivates them to become or to carry out acts of violence themselves. And governments all around the world have been developing what are called preventative counter-radicalization policies. And those kinds of policies are what are being put in place to deal with whether it's the so-called Islamist terrorist groups or far-right groups like or individuals who are part of the far right in places like Australia, where we saw this attack in New Zealand in Christchurch. I guess one of the key things about lone actors is that they never really act completely alone. They're still part of a society. This young man who carried out this horrible incident, this awful attack in New Zealand, was part of an online right-wing community that was very much against immigrants and Muslims and engaged in extremist debates and extremist ideas around, migration and ethnic minorities. And so those sort of negative ideas probably played a key role in inspiring this individual to go out and carry out such a horrendous attack. But of course, governments are trying to do something about this. They're trying to develop policies to try and prevent these kinds of things from happening, to stop people from going down this pathway in the first place. And that's what I'm going to come on to and talk about now. Does that answer your question, Ahmed? Ahmed says yes, all good. Right, so I'm going to move. Not a problem. He says thank you as well. I'm going to move forward. So, what we've done so far is we've looked at what we mean by terrorism. We've talked a little bit about counterterrorism. We've situated our discussion within debates about, is terrorism new? Is it different from the past? What do we mean by terrorists in the present 21st century context? We've picked a particular terrorist incident to provide as the basis for going into and analysing and discussing how we go about responding to terrorism. And what I want to do now is focus in on how the UK has been going about developing policies to try and prevent future attacks like the one on London Bridge in 2017. And it's worth noting, although that there has been a couple of incidents in the UK recently on London Bridge in 2017. In Westminster, there was an attack in 2017 where a police officer lost their life. And you may also have heard about the terrorist incident at the MEN Arena in Manchester at an Ariana Grande concert, again, where more people lost their lives. Thankfully, whilst obviously those events are tragic, the police and the security services in the UK have been doing an amazing job at keeping UK citizens safe. And one of the reasons, or part of the reason the government would say as to why they've been able to keep people relatively safe is that the UK has an overarching counter-terrorism strategy. It's called Contest. And I believe there have been now 5 iterations of the Contest strategy in terms of how to prevent terrorism in the UK. Okay, how long have I got? 20 minutes or so. Right, so responses to terrorism vary depending upon the country we're looking at. Some countries have highly developed counter-terrorism measures. The UK has had a history of dealing with terrorism in Northern Ireland since, many years ago, but particularly in the 1970s. And there are differences between the US. If you look at the way in which Russia deals with terrorist groups in its country, if you look at its responses in Chechnya in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, or even the countries in Europe, including the European Union as an overarching actor, all of them have considerable differences in how they go about preventing terrorism. And I'm going to look specifically at what the UK has done today, and as I said, the Contest strategy, which was recently updated in 2018. Now, the Contest strategy is made up of 4 key prongs, the 4 Ps. The first is prevent. This is the sort of counter-radicalization dimension of preventing people from becoming terrorists, right? So it's about stopping people from becoming terrorists or supporting terror, potentially before they've even thought of doing it themselves, right? So the idea here is it's about things like safeguarding, right? Supporting people who are vulnerable to so-called radicalization, stopping terrorists from or stopping people from becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. Part of this involves using resources from local government to deal with the threat from radicalization, to try and expand so-called multi-agency and rehabilitative interventions. So using all of the different actors from within civil society, using all of the different social services to try and find ways of preventing people from becoming terrorists. I do apologise. I've got a bit of a cough developing from talking without having a drink. So if you just give me a second. Okay, so that's prevent. Now the two elements of responding to terrorism that probably most link into crisis and disaster management are protect and prepare. So there's another strand to this called pursue. Now this is to pursue. I'm not going to look at today because it's more to do with responses to terrorism that look at finances. So tracking financial transactions and things like that. Protect and prepare are slightly different. They're what I would call the more crisis disaster management side of counterterrorism. So protect is about strengthening protection against a terrorist attack. And prepare is about mitigating the impact of a terrorist attack. So we think of the disaster management cycle. Protect is probably what happens before mitigation. Sorry, not mitigation. Preemption and prevention. And then prepare is about what's happened after a terrorist incident has occurred. So the impact of a terrorist incident. Okay, so protect is, it involves, for example, strengthening protection against a terrorist attack. It's about collating and analysing volumes of data from lots of different stakeholders, whether it's the UK border, the UK border agencies, whether it's the police themselves. It's about bringing together information from lots of different areas to try and detect and highlight and find and target previously unknown people. It includes things like border control measures, strengthening security and resilience across the transport network, so aviation, the local transport, the trains, the subways, all of those types of aspects of the transport network that need to be protected. It's also about what we can do in terms of crowded places where lots of people congregate, so looking after and protecting crowds, and then of course enhancing capabilities in terms of so-called chemical, biological, or radiological explosives and materials. So that's protect. The other one, as I said, is prepare. So mitigating in the event that a terrorist incident does occur. And that, again, is about bringing that incident to an end rapidly and recovering from it. So here we're talking about maintaining investments in the capabilities of the emergency services to coordinate an effective response to a terrorist attack, like as I described with what happened at London Bridge. Making sure that there's a sort of a multi-agency plan in place in terms of what to do when a terrorist incident occurs, to make sure that the police know their role, to make sure that the emergency services, the ambulances, the hospitals, that they're ready to deal with a terrorist incident as and when it occurs. And of course, what they do here is that they regularly test and exercise these multi-agency capabilities to make sure that they're able to respond to and recover from a wide range of terrorist incidents. So I just want to briefly introduce you to this concept of radicalization. Now, I wouldn't say that this sits within crisis and disaster management, because I think crisis and disaster management, of course, it's about preparing for terrorist incidents, or sorry, preparing for any kind of incident, but but if we're talking about the particular hazard here, we're talking about a terrorist incident. I think preventing radicalization goes a step further back than crisis and disaster management. This is about trying to prevent people from becoming terrorists before they've sometimes even thought of becoming a terrorist themselves. In terms of the concept itself, it's quite interesting. It first emerged in European policy circles, very much as a simple way of explaining the process by which individuals become involved in acts of terrorism and political violence. Interestingly, in terms of its use as a word in terms of terrorism and counterterrorism, it wasn't until probably 2001 that we first start to see the use of this term. So it is a very relatively new term, but in the last 18 years, it's sort of developed a life of its own, and now governments all around the world are really concerned with this idea of how do we prevent radicalization? How do we stop people from turning to terrorism at the earliest stage possible? It's very much appealed to the media and policymakers, I think, because it provides a very simple explanation for how people become involved in terrorism. And if we have simple explanations, it makes it a lot easier to develop a policy response. So it's very much about what goes on before the bomb goes off. And the argument that's put forward is that the primary motivation for why people carry out terrorist incidents today, it's either religion or ideology. They either come into contact with extreme forms of religion or extreme ideas that make them more likely to go about carrying out, an act of political violence. In the UK, as part of the contest strategy, they have something called the prevent strategy, which is one of the four prongs of the contest. And again, this has been very controversial in the UK. There's been criticisms of it, particularly amongst the Muslim community, who I think quite rightly feel, slightly targeted by the prevent strategy. There can be no doubt that if you go away and look at the policy documents themselves, especially in their earlier iterations, there is now more of a focus on the far right, especially in the light of particularly incidents in the UK. There was a murder of a British MP, Joe Cox, in the run-up to the 2016 election. And of course, what happened in New Zealand in Christchurch has brought a renewed focus on the far right. But it's from its very initial inception, right? Prevent very much focused on trying to draw in and engage with the Muslim community as a way of preventing terrorism. And so from the very start, prevent and radicalization has had a sort of a close link in with what's called so-called Islamist terrorism, and the consequence of that has been that for Muslim communities in the UK especially, they've felt slightly targeted by the prevent strategy. So it's very much a very controversial area within UK counterterrorism. In terms of its logic, as I suggested, it's very much what we call preemptive or precautionary, right? They talk about counter-radicalization as occurring within the pre-crime sphere. So it's about, identifying people who are potentially on a pathway to terrorism before they've committed a crime, and that itself can raise very serious issues, right? Because if someone hasn't committed a crime, how do you go about talking to them about the fact that you think that they might represent a terrorist threat? So again, very controversial area and just something to be aware of. Now, the way in which people identify potential terrorist threats in terms of people on this pathway of radicalization is that they identify, what are called indicators, trying to spot behaviors that might indicate someone is on a pathway to committing an act of terrorism. And there are three types of indicator. There's engagement, there's intention, and there's capability. And so intention indicators might include things like if an individual identifies another group as threatening, if they use insulting or derogatory names or labels towards another group, if they speak about the imminence of harm that the other group might be potentially might have on their own group, and the need to take action, condoning or supporting violence or harm towards others, or potentially plotting or conspiring with other people. All of these are potential indicators that someone might become or be on a pathway towards committing acts of terrorism. So again, these are the kinds of things that are focused on in terms of counter-radicalization. How do we go about identifying people who are on a particular pathway? Okay, so that's just some points on radicalization. If I was writing a crisis and disaster management essay in this area. I probably wouldn't. Hello? Did someone have a question there? Okay. There's a little bit of noise there. I'm not sure if someone was trying to ask a question. Does anyone have any questions so far on what I've been talking about?
Yes, Chris.
Yeah, go on, Yaktan.
I got a question regarding the governmental response due to an incident. The response, it's at all phases response. That's what indicators in terms of enhancement and improvement plans and programs, or we mean response during the incident, response to the incident itself.
Okay, so the indicators that I just highlighted there, so if I just go back and talk about those indicators there. Right, so these indicators here, these are intention indicators. These are to do with the stage of what's called radicalization, right? So the point where someone's becoming drawn into terrorism, right? So these intention indicators, they have nothing to do with the actual responding to a terrorist incident just before it's about to occur or whilst it's happening or even after it's occurred, right? These are a stage much further back. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do in terms of when a terrorist incident is about to occur or if we think it might occur, and then how we respond to the actual terrorist incident itself when it's occurring in just a second. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I meant the previous slide, the previous, I think, 2 slides before.
So I just go back a bit. Sorry. Which one was it, Yaktan, this one?
Yeah, this one regarding the governmental responses. This response is due to learning from the incident and how to do better for the next time. Is that?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, so in terms of the incident itself, right? So the two that are most focused in terms of the UK strategy for dealing with a terrorist incident after it's occurred or for learning from it are protect and prepare. Right, these two here to strengthen our protection against the terrorist attack, and then to mitigate the impact of a terrorist attack once it's occurred. Does that answer the question?
Yes, yeah, very much clear. Thank you.
What I'm going to do now, Yaktan, is I'm going to go into some detail about those two anyway, so hopefully it will make a bit more sense. Okay, so protect and prepare. Okay, so protect and prepare are about protecting before a terrorist incident and preparing for how to respond in the immediate aftermath of an attack. And as Yaktan said, also it's about learning from those attacks as we move forward. So the UK police, the intelligence services will have learnt from the terrorist incidents that occurred in 2017. They will be implementing the lessons that they learned from those incidents to try and make sure that the next time something like that happens, that their response is effective as well. Now, part of this is also about building awareness in society and in the community. So Protect also has what we might call a preventative security logic. It's about creating a national security culture. So here we're interested in making sure citizens are engaged with and take responsibility for security issues, and making sure that businesses and other stakeholders comply with protective security measures. It's to ensure that the risk of security incidents and breaches are reduced by encouraging all sectors of society to think and act in a more conscious, security conscious way. It might be about encouraging citizens to report behaviours or activities of concern, and it's about improving performances through effective management and establishing particular reporting mechanisms. So in the UK, one of the ways in which Protect and Prepare has worked in terms of developing this national security culture has been through trying to advertise to people and make them more aware of the threat from terrorism. So I'm going to show you some counter-terrorism adverts that were used in London as part of an advertising campaign. You see at the top here, these chemicals won't be used in a bomb because a neighbour reported the dumped containers. Or at the bottom, a bomb won't go off here because weeks before a shopper reported someone studying the CCTV cameras. So it's about, creating that awareness within society that terrorism is a threat and something that we should be concerned about. And making sure that people know what to do in the event that they see something suspicious. Again, terrorists won't succeed if someone reports suspicious bags, vehicles, or behaviours. They won't succeed if someone reports suspicious activity. Right? You are that someone. So we can see how these types of messages can be used to engender an understanding and awareness within society about the threat. Again, another rather recent advertising campaign was the Run, Hide, Tell campaign in London again. This is from Act on Counter-Terrorism. So again, more public information from the authorities. So telling citizens if they find themselves involved in a terrorist incident to run to a place of safety, to hide, turn your phone to silent, turn off the vibrate, barricade yourself in, and then of course phone the police and tell them what's happening. Only once it's safe to do so. And one of the ways in which in terms of crisis and disaster management, that the authorities, government has gone about trying to implement this type of advice and trying to make sure that stakeholders are better prepared for terrorist incidents is through something called Project Griffin and Project Argus, which is now been amalgamated into Act on Counter-Terrorism. Action Counters Terrorism, which is a sort of an awareness or an e-learning course. So Project Griffin was just basically, it's kind of like the stuff that you guys were doing with Richard in Oman in terms of CPD training. 1 or 2 day workshops where people from different parts of the community, different stakeholders, businesses and the like, were brought together to discuss the threat from terrorism, to bring together the police, the fire brigade, the ambulance services, private security industry, other government agencies, to talk about and discuss how you can go about reacting and responding to a terrorist incident. And Project Argus here was a sort of a 2-day workshop that was implemented, or with a 1-day simulation, where those stakeholders would again come together and discuss how to respond in the event of a terrorist attack, and what it is that you need to do. And this has now been transformed into a sort of an e-learning package in the United Kingdom, which has replaced Project Griffin, which is used for various stakeholders within the community, for businesses and the like. It's a set of e-learning modules that introduces people who want to take the training to terrorism, to security vulnerabilities, how to detect suspicious behavior, how to deal with suspicious items or a bomb threat, how to respond to a firearms attack, all of these types of things. So again, when we're thinking about crisis and disaster management and the terrorist threat, all of this relates here in terms of protect and prepare. And it's all about preparing various stakeholders for the threat of terrorism moving forward. I do apologize for coughing. Okay. Final set of slides before I wrap this up. I know I've been talking for almost an hour now, and I'm sure you're all ready to go and have your dinner if you haven't already. One last thing that I wanted to focus in on was recently, as I said, we think about the attack on London Bridge. We've had the use of motor vehicles to carry out terrorist incidents, and what this has led to, especially in Europe, is a move towards the development of what are called hostile vehicle mitigation measures. So the increase of or the expansion of barriers, protective security barriers all across the country, at places where there are major public events or large congregations of the public, of big crowds in big cities, where various stakeholders have come together to try and develop ways of mitigating the threat from terrorism. And the use of barriers has very much been an effective and very, very cost-effective and easy solution to try and protect people from terrorist incidents that might occur. And you might have noticed this, or you might not have noticed it, and you'll notice it more when you go to various public places, whether it's in your own country or anywhere in the world. We're seeing this more and more. If you have a look here, you have what's called defensive architecture. So on the left here, you have some public seating, but it's also been reinforced concrete, so a place where people can sit, but also a place, but also works as a barrier to protect the public from potential security threats. Again, here in the center, we have barriers, and on the right here, again, you can see steel barriers that people walk through when they enter sort of shopping areas. So ways of protecting the public without them even realizing it. In London Bridge, where the terrorist incident occurred, since that attack, so we talk about learning and responding to hazards and crisis events. You can see here, semi-permanent barriers have been put up to try and protect pedestrians crossing the bridge. So again, how governments learn from this kind of threat. And then finally, if you guys are interested, actually I'll just go back a couple of slides. There's a really interesting little video clip here. Hopefully it will work for you in Oman. If you click on this, it takes you through to a YouTube video on counter-terrorism through architecture, right? So how architects are helping contribute to the fight against terrorism. And it's about all of these kinds of things that I'm showing you here, how you can develop architecture to try and help protect and keep people safe. And on the right here, you have a picture of the new US Embassy in London. And one of the interesting things about this is, of course, its architecture as a dimension of emergency management, right? So there are 19 entry points into London now. In the past, there were many, many more, and the flow of traffic is all one way. And one of the reasons for this is it's much easier to control the flow of traffic. It's easier to potentially lock down the city if an incident occurs, but also to ensure that emergency services can move through the city quickly if an incident occurs. And what we've seen, as I said, is this sort of introduction of what's called defensive architecture. So what's sometimes known in the architectural trade as standoff. It's about designing security into the world around us. And if you look at the American Embassy on the right here, what's really interesting about this is it has a moat. You can see how far away the road is from the actual embassy. It's very difficult for a vehicle to get anywhere near the front of the embassy. The embassy itself is tiered in terms of how high it is from ground level, right? So you can see that even in architecture, you can design preparedness for the response to threats like terrorism. And the article I directed you towards by John Coffey talks about some of these issues as well. So if you're interested in that, go away and have a look at it. But of course, there are for people who are more focused on sort of political science like me, there's some interesting points around how this transforms our societies. Is there anything necessarily negative about bringing security into architecture? Is it an element of militarization occurring here? These are questions, political questions that are raised from these types of things as well. So crisis and disaster management, it's not just about policies and plans, but it's also about what happens in practice. Okay, I'm drawing to a close now, so I just want to finish this by just saying a few final points to recap what I've discussed today. Terrorism today is both similar to, but it's also different from the past. Yes, there's a dimension. There is an element to the terrorism of today being different from the past, but there's questions over the extent to which there is a new and an old terrorism. But stuff for you to go and look at if you're interested. We've seen the rise of lone actor terrorism, that should say, especially in the West. The targets of attacks, crowded public spaces, the types of weapons used, vehicles now as opposed to bombs. So there has been a transformation, and this transformation in threat very much factors into how we go about responding to the threat from terrorism. In terms of responses, you have the longer term prevent and what's called counter-radicalisation. In the shorter term, you have the more crisis disaster management, protect and prepare in the UK, which is before and after an attack. And these ideas around creating a security culture, raising awareness within society, developing multi-agency approaches, and ensuring also that the awareness that individuals carry out these attacks, that they can come from the very communities that you work with in response to the disaster itself. But so can the information that's needed to prevent these attacks too. Okay. I'm aware that was probably a little bit longer than I should have gone for, but hopefully you all found that interesting. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, Chris, if I may.
Yes, go for it, Yaktan.
Very interesting case study, and thank you for wrapping up the information in such a short time. I just wondering regarding if we choose a different case studies, like for example intentional disasters such as an air crash or land crash, or do we go to the same process, or is it it should be a different method on how we attack the issues?
Okay, so yeah, no, of course, how you would go about writing an essay on counter-terrorism and crisis and disaster management, how you go about writing about any particular topic within this area will probably be slightly different. I think with the sort of the terrorism literature, it's a little bit easier to do a bit more contextual discussion, to go into great detail about the concept of terrorism, the threat from terrorism. I think if you were to look at, say, for example, an air crash, you would be similar in terms of talking about the event itself, providing a description of what happened, talking about maybe similar events in the past, how this relates, have lessons been learned, and then to go into a discussion of, the sort of policy response, whether it's looking at whichever stage of the crisis disaster management cycle. If it's about preparing for future accidents, or if it's about learning lessons, responding to and ensuring those kinds of incidents don't occur again in the future. So there would be elements that are similar to the structure that I've laid out here today, but you probably wouldn't need to go into the sort of conceptual detail that I've suggested around counter-terrorism.
Yes, very clear. Thank you.
And again, just to be aware, I've only picked this topic because obviously it's one that I know a lot about and I'm very interested in. And the idea for this module is, yeah, of course, go away and look at whatever intentional, social, technological disaster you find interesting. So if you're interested in the recent, air crashes involving the Boeing 737 Maxes or 787, which I forget what number it is. But anyway, the Boeing 737s, the 8 Max that's crashed on a number of occasions, you can go away and look at that. You can look at, major traffic accidents. You could look at, factory fires. You could look at what happened at Grenfell in the United Kingdom. There's so many different areas that you can go away and look at. And I guess what I would suggest is, for any of these, to try and link it back into the crisis disaster management cycle, to look at maybe one or two elements of it, because today what I've done is, in terms of the crisis disaster management cycle, I've introduced you to counter-terrorism in the UK and protect and prepare, which are the stage just before and the stage after in the crisis disaster management cycle. So I'd use that cycle as a way of thinking about preparing for and responding to whatever hazard it is that you focus on in terms of intentional, technological or sociological disasters.
Yes, Chris, thank you very much. And do we go further and discuss how this incident that will help improve our agency or our organization or government to reflect back to our on our context in Oman, or just focusing on the scenario itself and how that country have learned from that lesson?
I would say the latter. So I'd say it's more about ensuring you talk about that incident and how that country has learned from that. However, if you set the question up at the start, or you set the essay up at the start in terms of your signposting that, say, for example, you wanted to write this essay with an eye to using it in your own organization, as long as you set it up at the start and say that, maybe the final section of the essay is going to look at not just the lessons that this country has learned, but what my country could learn from it, then that would be acceptable as well. So I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. You can, but you just need to set it up in the introduction that you're going to bring in some analysis that extends your discussion into considerations for Oman or your own organization.
That's very much clear now. Thank you very much.
Any further questions?
Yes, please. I have a question regarding the essay itself. So, should one paragraph include the summary of the attack if I choose the terrorism part?
Sorry, can you say that again, Asma? I didn't quite catch that. Well, I think my computer broke up a little bit there.
Okay, no worries. I was just saying, if I choose the terrorism topic, should I include one paragraph that includes a summary of the attack itself, and should that be written in the past?
Yeah, no, I would. Again, you can write it in any tense depending on the context in which you're writing your answer. But I would, yeah, if you're going to talk about a particular terrorist incident and then how countries or states have learned from or they respond to that incident, then definitely write a paragraph or two just explaining what happened, as a way of then highlighting the problems with that incident in terms of the response, or the deficiencies, or what was good about it, and then that will allow you to go into sort of a more developed critical analysis of that. But yeah, definitely include a description of the event, and that goes for any essay in this area, right? When you pick your event or your issue, a couple of paragraphs describing the event and telling us what you're looking at is really important. So like I said, with the Boeing 737s that crashed, you might start by saying, in I think was it last summer or earlier this year, 2018, 2019, there was an airplane crash in Indonesia. This is what happened. Or there was an airline crash in Ethiopia. This is what happened. So definitely describe the event.
Okay, great. And for this comes the introduction, of course, which includes the definitions and stuff in history.
Again, it depends on how you want to structure it. There's no fast and right way of doing any essay, but I would probably describe the event in the introduction, unless you need to talk about the event in great detail, in which case you talk about it immediately after the introduction. But I would definitely, the introduction doesn't necessarily need to define the key concepts. I would save the key concepts for after the introduction. So your introduction is to simply set the context for the essay and then tell the reader how it's going to unfold.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, any further questions, people? Dave, your microphone went green then. Did you ask a question?
Chris, I was waiting to see if somebody else came in. I was just going to say thank you very much indeed. That was very clear and very interesting. Yeah, that gives good context for the next case study. So, no, just really thank you very much.
Thanks for the kind and positive words. That's very, very kind of you. And thank you to everyone who said thank you on the chat box as well. I hope that you've found today's class interesting. And just so you're all aware, I'm going to be going on leave later on in the week, so I'm not back until the 8th of July. I'll start back, and we'll have a couple of tutorial sessions. I believe I've got them set up for the Wednesday. So on Monday, the 8th of July, I'll send out a sort of a doodle poll, or I'll give you some time slots on WhatsApp, and we'll have some tutorials based around the first draft of your essay, which I expect to come in on the the 5th of July, the 7th of July at the very latest, please, ladies and gentlemen. And we'll have some tutorials on the 10th, just to go through what you've been doing in the 2 weeks while I'm away. And please don't forget that you have a webinar next week with my colleague Gareth Mott from Nottingham Trent University. We'll be talking about cybersecurity issues, so very similar to what I've talked about today, but focusing on, in terms of structure, but focusing on cybersecurity. And then Lee's going to be doing something on lessons learned from intentional disasters 2 weeks' time. So I hope that you will crack on with your work over the next 2 weeks, and I'll speak to you all soon. And if you do have any questions, do feel free to email me. But like I said, I won't probably be getting back to you until later in July, 8th of July. Okay, so thanks for coming today, guys, and I'll see you all later.